Hello, screenwriters, and welcome to Writing for Screens. Today's episode, How has the industry changed since you started out? My name is Glenn Gers, and I am the Chief Operating Everything here at Writing for Screens, a channel that I created in order to take some of the skills and tools and insights that I had to figure out for myself in a 25-year career writing for TV and movies. On my way out of the business, I am trying to leave behind some form of useful notes, tips, things to think about in the form of this channel. Here's a screen grab of the current channel live page, main page. If you scroll down, you can see that there are some playlists. These first three playlists, as you scroll, are Screenwriting Essentials, Screenwriting Tools, Skills, and Craft, and The Process, Being a Writer. These three playlists have about 50 videos to get all told together. Each one is about 10 minutes long. Each one has a big, bright thumbnail with a big, bold title that tells you what it's about. The whole thing is broken into little lessons, 10-minute lessons on genre, dialogue, flashbacks, character, all the stuff that I could think of that you might want to try and figure out. Anything I know about it, I put in there in as crisp and simple and user-friendly as I could make it. The idea is you got to try these things out for yourself, see which work for you, which don't, because there is no formula, there is no rule, there is no answer to creative work. You got to figure out what works for you. You're going to want to do different things and you're going to be in a different place than other people. The only thing that we know is that you need to work out for yourself, as every artist does, what you do and how you do it. The only way to do that is to try it, figure out for yourself. I am providing you with a bunch of things to try, things to think about, see how they do for you. That's what this is all about. Having done those 50 videos, it took a while, I then started to do live streams. I do them now once a week, every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific time zone. I come on and talk about a different topic. Today's topic is about how the industry, the Hollywood film industry that I work in, has changed since I started. Before I get into that, I'm going to do a quick hellos, and then I will get into this topic, which should take about half the hour. Then you can ask me questions. Doreen, how you doing? Hi, Sonia. Jens, good to see you. And Doug, you are very welcome. Pelicans and Michael and Donna and Hasko. Wow, everybody's here. Great to see you all. Thank you for coming. Let's get to it because it's a giganzo question that I got to answer. The question was asked last week. Towards the end of the live stream, Skepular came on and said, how has the industry changed since you started? Which was just mind-blowingly big when I started to think about it. So I said, I can't answer that now. I'm answering it today. I don't want to just do a walk down memory lane, as tempting as that is. The point of this is to be useful to you. And so therefore, I'm going to try and steer this towards the helpful insights, the helpful ideas. The biggest one having to do with technology changing art and culture, because that's really the biggest change. But it's been happening increasingly over the decades since I started. You have to remember, I started in the 1980s, early 1980s. Really kind of started in the 70s, but for purposes here, I'm going to talk purely about the 80s till now. And in that time, we have seen waves of technology transforming the business and the art. And so the first thing I want to talk about is that's not going to stop. Tech is changing everything. It's changing more and it's changing faster than ever before. There was a period back at the very beginning of film history at like 1905 when there probably was as much revolution as there is now. But honestly, since the beginning of film history, the screen industry, this moment is the most change that has ever happened. And so the main thing I want to talk about is what you can do with that. because honestly, the rest is history. One of the main things that you might notice is the incredible changes that we're talking about happening within my career. I'm old, but I'm not that old. Within my lifetime, we have gone through several revolutions, not just one. And so I want to sort of advise you against long-term planning. I used to think I was working out plans for, I'll do this, and then that'll lead to, excuse me, and I had these big plans. The world was changing simply too fast for any of those big plans to happen, aside from the fact that they never happened. No, when you're talking about an industry that has so much sway over our ability to work, I strongly advise against long-term planning, big planning. Be open, be flexible, because as you will see looking at what I went through, you cannot possibly plan for a revolution in which an entire medium like film and an entire medium like television change places. The other thing I want to talk to is the idea of progress, the idea that we can look at the story of the film industry, the story of history, and figure out that it is going in a certain direction and that direction is the right direction. That is a progress toward something. I cannot say I believe in that anymore. I believe that it's chaos. We are in a particularly chaotic moment, but it's also evidence of the fact that things are changing, forces are happening. It is not a direction. It is a constant shift and flow. And honestly, the best you can do, as far as I can tell, is ride it, is observe it, is try and keep an eye on what's happening, and then do the best you can within that. Because seriously, there's no way to predict. Let's just talk a little bit. Hi, Madco. I'm not going to do any questions until I've finished the topic of the day. What I will do is make a copy of your question, and then I will get to that soon. About half an hour, I would say. Okay, I started out in the 1980s. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. By the time the 1980s hit, I got out of college in 1982, more or less. And at that time, I chose among the many arts I was interested in. I loved theater, I loved novels, I loved art. But I chose screenwriting partly because of the moment I was in. In that moment, there was a rise of the screenwriting celebrity. The scriptwriter had been kind of a joke in most of the history of the art form. In the early part of it, everybody just wrote whatever they wanted. Nobody even wrote scripts. A lot of times they just sort of made it up as they literally wrote it as they were filming it. The screenwriter as a hack, as an employee, as a crass operator in a crass business, that extended all the way up into the late 70s. And in the 1980s, that began to change. And I will talk about that. One of the reasons it changed was because the industry itself had changed. The industry was locked into a studio factory monopoly from the 1930s all the way through the 1970s. However, in the late 40s, early 50s, the studio system began to break apart. And for the first time, employees of the movie studios were free agents, which they had not been before. They were employed on 7-year contracts. You were sort of property of the factory. In the 70s and early 80s, there was an increase in the agencies. The big agencies began to get much more powerful and much more play oriented. They were operating at a higher level of greed, honestly. It was the rise of the big agency. And as a result, screenwriting prices, in other words, a hot script, began to get auctioned between studios, and this caused an enormous rise in the pay per script for freelance writers. So all of a sudden, people were getting $1 million a script. Script sales were getting very, very big. As a result, that became news, and people began to think, oh, screenwriting is this thing. Also, the the art of film began to get respected. In the late 60s and through the 70s, the idea that film was a legitimate art form, not just cheesy, crappy, popular entertainment, began to rise. And the concept of film as art began to be studied, and therefore the people who worked in film, instead of being carny hacks, became artists. So the rise of the screenwriter happened just as I was getting out of college. I loved film, and I thought, oh, well, if I'm going to choose to work in theater or film or fiction, novels, screenwriting's the one that's going to pay. Like, screenwriting could pay for whatever else I wanted to do. So that's why I chose of my possible art paths, that one. This coincided with the collapse of the studio factories and the rise of corporate takeover of the studios. In other words, all the movie studios, which had been monopolizing the industry from the late 20s all the way through the 60s, even when they were forced to sell their theaters, which originally they owned the theaters, so they had a complete monopoly, they became targets for takeovers by bigger corporations, Coca-Cola, Transamerica. All these big companies bought movie studios, and they were not in the entertainment fields. Coca-Cola obviously wasn't. Transamerica, I think, was an insurance company. There was a company that essentially started from parking lots that ended up buying MGM UA, I believe. Anyway, the point is, every single studio was bought by a larger multinational corporation, and they became the entertainment division of those. I'm not sure if Disney did, but Disney in itself became a conglomerate. This rise meant that studios were now being controlled by corporate interests. Paramount was owned by Gulf and Western. And as a result, there was a certain demand for the studios, especially, to become more international. You had to think more about selling globally, which is difficult because only certain types of film will translate. So all of that happened at the same time that the movie theater industry began to go into the multiplex business, so that all of a sudden one theater would have 4 screens, 18 screens, whatever. This fed into the concept of I know I'm going very fast. Oh well. The multiplex coincided with the concept of the big opening weekend. In the mid to late 70s, starting with Jaws, I believe, and then Star Wars, but there were a bunch of others. The big opening weekend, the idea of selling as many tickets as you could in that first weekend and trying to put it out all over the country at the same time, that same weekend. Partly that helped to spread the advertising costs. Instead of opening in a couple of big cities and then slowly moving to others, which required advertising in all of those places, they would simply force a weekend and completely blockbust the advertising, especially television advertising. So that really changed the business, because now a movie had to open big. If it was going to support that amount of ad buy, they had to have a movie that would open wide, which we now all consider normal. That was not the original way that movies were opened. First of all, there was a weekly churn of movies in the studios. There's simply a new movie every week at the local theater. But the other thing that they would do is that if it was a big movie, they would actually open in just a couple of theaters, make an event out of it, and then do what they called a road show, where they would actually take the movie to different places as if it was theater. All of that went away with the rise of the multiplex and the blockbuster weekend. What does this have to do with screenwriting? Well, obviously, if you are trying to work in this business, this confluence of things made that everyone was working on what they were hoping was the high concept, which is another thing that rose in the 1980s. The idea of something that you could sell to the audience, but also within the business. You could do the elevator pitch, the 2-line, 2-sentence. This is, a cop is Die Hard in a circus, Die Hard in a factory, whatever it was. The idea of a very, very simple premise that could sell very, very wide, that rose in the 1980s. The concept that you would try to get in the entire country to go to it, so that you could not have something that was for an obscure or difficult or challenging audience. You were trying to get everyone, which included the kids, the grandparents, everybody comes to the show, they go see E.T., everybody likes it. That was a relatively new phenomenon. It used to be that certain types of films were for certain types of people. And they simply didn't expect that big an audience. And there wasn't required to be the biggest selling thing of all times. It simply had to be profitable. Obviously, everyone wants a hit, but the definition of a hit actually changed from the big weekend. Previously, it had been a longer term. The idea of something running for a year. Nothing runs for a month now. So that's what was happening in the 80s. At the same time, two other major things happened. The first was the rise of independent film. Got its beginnings in the 1970s. First, what happened was the studio system originally, as I said, they owned the theaters. So from the 1920s until the 1950s, you simply couldn't play a movie. There was no theaters that could play your movie because they were owned by the studios and they weren't going to play an independent film. So there was no independent cinema. When that system broke down because the courts ordered it antitrust, they said you have to sell the theaters. Many theaters began to look to independent films as a way to draw in big crowds, especially small theaters, especially things like drive-ins, cheesy little theaters. They loved exploitation films because people would go to them fairly indiscriminately, and they would drag people from the mainstream, give them things that they could only get in these exploitation films: sex, motorcycles, drugs, all the stuff that was forbidden in standard Hollywood movies. So the first wave of independent film was actually exploitation film. However, at that same time, there was another wave of foreign films. The foreign films now had a place to go. They had theaters that would show them. And they were mind-blowing to a lot of artistically minded people. So in the 50s and 60s, the independent film world had these two converging influences. One was exploitation, and the other was art film from other countries. The result was the 70s, in which all these young filmmakers, influenced by both of those poles, were putting out weird, difficult, challenging, and often really crappy movies. But there was a youth audience. Bonnie and Clyde, Easy Rider, a bunch of movies had come out at the end of the 60s, which showed that the young people wanted more daring films. And indie film was feeding that. And that really began to blow up in the 1980s. There was a movie called The Return of the Secaucus Seven by John Sayles in 1980, kind of opened up this concept. Before that, Woman Under the Influence, 74, was really the biggest shocker that this sort of thing could happen. But very, very quickly, as this trend began to open up, Jim Jarmusch's Stranger Than Paradise, Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It, Stranger Than Paradise was 84, She's Gotta Have It was 86, Sex, Lies, and Videotapes, Steven Soderbergh's breakthrough, was 89. So in the 80s, these very low-budget films that were relating to life that was not being taken on in the Hollywood world began to find audiences. So that by the end of the 80s, independent film became a business. So now I'm going to talk about the 90s. Oh, wait, no, I'm not. I'm going to talk about one other thing that happened during this indie period. A big change that I've been thinking about recently is the concept of selling out. In the period that we're talking about, first of all, movies were not considered an art form by most people until the late 1960s. Until then, they were trash. They were entertaining, but they were garbage. Nobody took them seriously. No serious artist would work in the movies. Playwrights famously would go to Hollywood, try and cash a check or two, and then get the hell out. In the 1980s, two things happened. One is the respectability of Hollywood began to rise with the auteur 70s films. But the other thing that happened was that the idea that you were making a lot of money at an art became much more popular. It sounds weird, but in truth, esteem was far more important to artists than money. It was not that nobody was going to turn down money, nobody minded having a hit, but the most important thing for artists was being respected by the culture, by the other artists, by the press. That began to change with these big blockbusters. When Jaws and Star Wars opened on 3,000 screens, I don't know if it was 3,000 then, may have been just 1,000, doesn't matter. It changed the culture. Popular culture began to be the culture instead of just a low, disgraceful enjoyment underneath high culture. In the 1980s, famously, Greed is Good, from the movie Wall Street, the box office numbers began to show up as news. The largeness of a hit became of cultural importance. And that changed things because there were many, many artists who felt that was selling out. In other words, if you were to make an immensely popular film, you were a sellout, and that was bad. You don't even hear that concept anymore. It is very rare to hear someone talk about even the word selling out. It seems like that's a good thing. So those are the main things that were happening. The other thing that started to happen in the 80s was the rise of home video. VHS happened in the 80s, and this changes the release of films because you don't need theaters anymore. You can have a movie come out, goes to theaters for a little while to get some respect and publicity, but then it really makes its money at video stores. And what that meant was that a low-budget movie, an indie film or a genre film, could become very profitable. The other thing that happened was that there was more demand. Someone would go in and rent 5 movies. So the churn, the amount of product coming out now had a new way to reach the audience. And a lot of low-budget films, a lot of genre films, cult films became available to the wider audience. It used to be if an art film came out, if a low-budget genre film came out, you simply wouldn't see it in most of the country. There weren't screens. You would never have heard of it. They're not going to be on TV. Now you can browse the shelves and see all this stuff. Furthermore, since it wasn't being officially rated, all sorts of things that were taboo became acceptable content. All of this created the world that we are now in. But at the time, it was really a cool experiment. It was an adventure. Things were opening up. It was also the beginning of the concept of infinite choice, that you can go to the video store and decide what you're going to see instead of having to just go to the 3 or 4 theaters in your town if you're lucky and see what happens to be playing at that moment. If you missed a movie from 5 years ago, if you wanted to see a classic or an obscure film, you can do that. That completely changed the understanding of what was possible in movies. And the other thing that was happening was TV was even lower than the low. Those movies were not considered very respectable. TV was a joke to the movie industry. You didn't work in TV if you wanted to be a respectable filmmaker. And in the 1980s, there began to be a hint. It had started in the 70s with Norman Lear, but Stephen Bochco created a show called Hill Street Blues. He did a bunch of others that began to open up the concept that you could do new and challenging and interesting experiments with TV. That you could, even within the highly regulated and rated, censored world of television, you could create long-term ongoing stories, that you could create characters in depth, that you could take on interesting subject matter. All of that was sort of bubbling under the surface in the 90s. It was going to explode in the 80s. In the 90s and It exploded in the 90s and really, really flourished starting in the 21st century. So let's talk about the 90s. Hello, hello, hello. I'm going to get to your comments in a bit. I'm going to just keep churning through this history of the film industry since I started in the 1980s. The 1990s, all of these phenomenon simply bulked up. And this is when I actually start to work. I had an agent. I had begun to write scripts. I was I was working for film companies, but I did not really work as a professional writer in the 1980s. I sold an option. I was meeting a lot of people. I was in the fringes, but I was not working. In the 1990s, I started to work. This was the era of development hell or development heaven, depending on how you want to look at it. Because when the corporations bought these studios, they ramped up the development process, which meant that in order to figure out which films that they would make, they would hire or usually purchase option scripts from different writers and have them take notes and do drafts to see if they could get into the shape they wanted to make. The way that they did this was extraordinarily wasteful, but an incredible blessing to screenwriters, which was, if they were going to make a movie, they generally were developing what I heard at the time was 50-1. In other words, they would option 50 scripts. They would pay for 50 rewrites, and then they would choose among that which one they were going to make. That meant that 49 writers were getting paid Hollywood union rates, high money, to write something that the studio was going to then throw away. This was kind of mind-blowing and frustrating. It was part of the general degradation of the life of a screenwriter, because a screenwriter, you would spend a year, sometimes doing multiple drafts, working very, very hard to get these scripts just right to show to a dozen people at a company, and then they would just say no, and it would be gone. It would never reach an audience. No one would know it existed. There was no IMDb. This simply meant that you were only known for writing these scripts. They would talk about it in the business. Things would get passed around in the business. But honestly, you did not exist culturally. You had no satisfaction except trying to please the business. The business has very, very narrow tastes and very, very specific agendas. But that's how you could make a glorious living, which is a rare thing for an artist, if you were willing to have your work destroyed by multiple rewrites and different people, and if you were willing to never have it see the light of day. And that actually was a struggle for me at the beginning. I was like, this is insane. I'm not going to not do it because the money was so good. But at the same time, artistically, it was hell. It was death. The 90s were also the peak of the star system. At the time, it was felt by the studios that simply the way that you sold a movie was by attaching stars. And those stars, they began to pay monumental salaries, getting up to $20 million. Weirdly, that's not that big anymore. But at the time, that was insane. But so what everyone was constantly doing was trying to attract and attach a handful of what they called bankable stars. In other words, stars that the business judged big enough names that their face on the poster would get people to buy tickets. So that steered the way that stories were told towards this concept of the hero's journey. You needed to give that star a hell of a part. The idea of stories about multiple characters, this idea of stories with complexity, those were out the window because you wanted those star personalities to sign on to get your film the green light. As a result, the people who were at the time writing how to write screenplay books said, well, this is the formula for success. Now, that was the formula for success in the 90s. It doesn't work anymore. But unfortunately, because this was the period when the celebrity screenwriter started, it was the beginning of the how to write screenplay books classes empire. That empire was frantically trying to figure out what it was that made something successful. They were only working within a very, very narrow business. And yet they put forth their rules, and those rules are still parroted today as eternally and universally meaningful. They're not. It was just what was a big business in America at the time in the 1990s and 2000s. The other thing that happened was that independent film, having become, it was so bizarre that a film that cost, $25,000 could make $1 million, that the independent film began to become an interesting genre to the studios, especially because of Sundance and Miramax. Sundance Film Festival, it was originally called the U.S. Film Festival, had been around for a long time. It was not very well regarded. The Sundance Film Institute, started by Robert Redford, took over in the late 80s. And in the 90s, Sundance became the center of independent film. At that time, Miramax, which was a fairly cheesy company in New York, began to, it had taken the concept, which was the basic independent film concept from the old days, which was a mixture of exploitation and art film. And they began to create this machinery in order to feed the awards system. Harvey Weinstein, legendary monster in many ways, in all ways really, created a push within the industry to essentially steer votes at award ceremonies to his films, and this made independent film a huge business. Pulp Fiction was enormous. At the time, that became the model in which every single studio said, well, we want to do that. We want to get into that business. So they all opened independent divisions. So the studios opened independent film divisions. And of course, independent film essentially became a genre of studio film. This was bad, actually, and it made for a lot of interesting movies. But overall, it created, the system absorbed the outsiders. At the same time, towards the end of the 90s, prestige television began to develop. Because of cable and home video, it was possible to put things on television that were not available in your home. You could see nudity, you could see violence, you could hear curses, you could see people sleeping in double beds. So all of a sudden, cable TV and home video allowed for an artistic rebirth within home broadcasting. The other thing that happened was because of home video, like if somebody put out a series on VHS, having aired it, you could keep track of the serialized stories. One of the biggest reasons that television would not do serialized stories, they would do an episode at the begin and end, and then the next week there would be a new case, a new story. Even in ongoing series about a particular detective, they had a new case every week. But because you could never be sure that people would be able to watch every single episode. It was only on Thursday at 10. You might miss a Thursday and then you wouldn't know what was happening in the story. Once things began to get recordable, when VHS happened, people could record the show when it aired and watch it whenever. So storytelling became serializable. People could tell a story ongoing and trust that the audience was going to follow it because they would record the show. Huge change in the nature of storytelling. A wonderful one, frankly. So that's where we were in the 90s. I'm going to get to your questions and comments in a minute. We're moving into the 2000s. In the 2000s, technology changed in the 2000 to 2010, unlike anything that had ever happened before. The closest that we can come is the invention of mass media, or perhaps the Industrial Revolution. Digital technology has changed everything in our world. It has changed communications, it has changed politics, it has changed society, it has changed everything, obviously, It changed the entertainment business. The main scope of this is the things that I was talking about before, the ability for entertainment to go home and for you to watch it on demand, to be able to choose what you watch and to see it when you want it. That grew. It was happening at home with VHS and DVD in the 2000s. However, once the iPhone came out and the concept of streaming, first of all, Netflix opened up a way for you to get the DVDs without even having to go to the store. They would mail them to you, and they were very efficient about that. And it opened up a much wider scale of possible things to watch. This allowed for a lot of unspoken voices, unattended to audiences, to be able to put their stuff out there and reach their audience. That's really cool. But it also meant that the culture broke down in the sense that there was no center. You could watch your stuff and have no idea of what was happening in other people's stuff. So the volume available was mind-blowing, but it was also overwhelming, and no single thing could become very important for very long. That's a change we are still reckoning with culturally. It's a change that we are definitely reckoning with in terms of the business, because there's no longer the blockbuster mentality that started in the 70s and went through till now is sort of dead because they can't manufacture anything that will get that large an audience. So therefore, the question is, what do they make? Who do they attend to? And the answer for the companies is as much as possible for as many people as possible without a center. And therefore, the churn is meaning that I was reading recently that people who are doing self-publishing books, the theory was you have to write and publish a book a month. Book a month. Whatever it is that's the biggest hit of the moment. Let's put it this way. Deadpool and Wolverine was gigantic last summer. It's not even a memory now, let alone like Barbenheimer. That's distant history. Whatever is happening now is not going to be happening in a couple of months. The speed of production, the speed of development is much longer than that, which means that you can never target the trend. The trend is simply moving too fast. The other thing that happened when digital started was that the gatekeepers and the structure of importance changed, because originally it was simply critics and essentially the editors or publishers or studio executives chose what was going to be in the culture. The critics and simply lost their power because the digital systems don't work by critic, they work by algorithms, they work by direct contact to the audience members, and the social media opened up anyone can be an influencer and influence the things that are important in the culture. So they lost control of the trends, and they began to desperately chase wherever the algorithm and the influencers were going. It's impossible to write for that. It's changing too fast for anyone in production to be able to attend to it. So all of that is what's changed. All of that is what's happening. There were no serious franchises when I grew up. James Bond, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, the books. Genres were possible, but not series of works. There were serialized popular films like the Andy Hardy movies. They weren't taken seriously. They were not real. The other thing that happened in the 2000s was the strike, the first Writers Guild strike of this century, which coincided with the financial crisis. 2007, 2008, the Writers Guild went on strike because they knew that digital was happening. They saw the future and they said, if we do not try and negotiate contracts that allow the unions to work as they have in this new system of distribution, the entire business will collapse, and essentially screenwriting will become a gig work. And that, in fact, is essentially what has been happening. That strike and the financial crisis badly damaged the industry. The system that I had been talking about, the development of 50 to 1, that died then. That was the studio's recognition that they also could not keep doing the system that they had been because they no longer owned the business. There were new forms of business coming, and they didn't own them. Tech was opening up a new form of distribution. Streaming did not need theaters, did not need televisions, did not need networks, did not need any of those things. They opened up a new form of distribution and completely destroyed the industry as it was known. What is happening now is that we don't know what that is going to bring. So the big advice I can give is accept that you are in a time of chaos. Accept that there is no way to ride the trend. The best thing you can do is, as I said, be open, be flexible, consider other art forms. This is now a time when there has never been, because of digital technology, there has never been more opportunity to be directly creative. You can make a film. That was not possible when I started. The equipment that it took to make a film was way too expensive. Now, you got it in your pocket. It's right there. So the first thing is that you can do anything. What you can't do is make a lot of money from it or become part of the center of the culture. The odds of you doing that are microscopic. Yes, 1 or 2 people will do it, but you can't count on that. I'm going to stop now. I actually had a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop because we've got a lot of questions and comments, and I'm going to try and get to them. Okay. Hello. UK clocks changed. So Adam says, hi. Hi, Adam. Howdy, Gene. Kirby Light, why did you retire from film? Sorry if that's been asked. No, the answer would be I had been doing it for a while. Honestly, I was getting old, and old people were not particularly delighted. People weren't necessarily saying, oh, I want to hire an old guy in this time of change, in this time of social media, in this time of all these things happening. An old guy was not that interesting. The other thing that happened was that the price of an old guy is much higher than the price of a newcomer. So therefore, it was simply hard to hire me because I was my salary my starting salary was going to be higher than starting somebody new. The other thing is I was difficult, and it's frankly miraculous that I made it as long as I did because I was not easy to work with. I argue a lot. I did not understand the subservience required in the job. I really didn't. I learned it very late. Partly because I am talented and I am hardworking, I got away with things that I shouldn't have. I was regarded well when I was not being particularly helpful. And as a result, after a while, it was hard to find somebody who didn't say, I can find somebody who's going to be easier to work with. And by the time that was happening, I was beginning to learn not to feel like, oh, crap, I'm doing a bad thing, but actually learn that that's my job, that the job was not to be a fierce fighting artist who fought for every single decision, but to help the other people make their movie. I honestly didn't get that until late in my career. At that point, a fair number of people were like, nah, he's too much trouble. Also, a lot of the companies that I'd worked with, frankly, went out of business. So anyway, that's why I retired. And because I was lucky, I had been in the business for 20 years, I had built up a pension and I could afford to retire, which is a rare thing. Hi, Lake Filter. What is cultural importance? That is a great question. Since we're talking about history here, cultural importance currently is different. Cultural importance currently has to do with social media and the acceptance of both a wide audience for very brief amounts of time and a few very large corporations. But when I started out, cultural importance was determined by a group of gatekeepers, not necessarily a form of culture I advise or would stand up and say, that's great. But there were a bunch of editors, publishers, movie executives, TV executives, literally a small handful of old white guys who decided what was and wasn't going to be on the screens, on the pages. And that determined the culture. They were influenced by a bunch of people in their circle, critics, various essayists, various artists. They all were a club. And that determined when I started out, that was how culture was guided. There was a high culture, which slowly became a popular culture, but was still guided by a group of gatekeepers. That broke up with the arrival of digital technology, which said you can sell more or reach more people, and the determination on what is going to happen is going to be made by an algorithm and by a bunch of people who happen to catch on a thing and they ride that algorithmic wave. It's actually kind of deceptive because the algorithm steers people towards things. First of all, we don't know what the algorithm is steering towards, but whatever is popular for any reason becomes more popular. That was not always true. It could be that something was popular in the 1980s, and frankly, the culture guardians said, ew, we don't like that. We're not going to feature that. That no longer happens. If it's popular, it takes over. And what happens is once something is popular, the algorithm picks up that it's popular and distributes it more. So the algorithm is feeding popularity indiscriminately. And by the way, like I said, some of that's good, some of it's bad. It's tricky. Now, what's happening to streaming nowadays? What's happening to streaming nowadays is it is too big to fail. It is too powerful at the moment for anybody to do anything except try and feed it, try and get some money from it, and hope that you get a few minutes of attention. Streaming owns the culture. Digital technology owns the culture. There's the only thing that is nice is that you can use the technology to go off in your niche. If you don't mind that you're not making money, you can build an audience, you can build a community, you can build a culture of your own. And that's kind of cool. VHS and DVD is not as toxic as a streaming platform. I agree. Streaming platforms, by the way, don't have to do that. They could easily be curated. There's a lot of things that you can do with the technology that the companies are not doing because they are evil empires. Good day, Dialogue Craft. Do you think it's acceptable to write a screenplay to play with religion? I have an idea for God versus Buddha. Acceptable to who? That's the question. Is it acceptable to the various people who produce movies? Probably not. Why would they want to stir up a contentious controversy that will only breed hatred and violence? Because no matter what you do on those topics, you're going to stir up people who are going to take extreme stands. No matter what you're saying, you may be saying something very reasonable and open. Doesn't matter. It's going to be completely turned into chaos. So the answer is it acceptable artistically? Absolutely. If you want to do it, do it. But do recognize that the business is generally not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Paul Schrader, a film snob, went from commercial to personal films. You know, he kind of goes back and forth. And the thing to remember about Paul Schrader is that he did commercial films in that very brief moment when snobby personal films were commercial films. That's the thing that people forget. The 70s, the commercial films were things like Taxi Driver. Okay. What is an interesting subject for you? Well, I thought this was interesting. We'll see if that's true. By saying when you start working in the 80s, you kind of give away your age. My age is coming up on 67 in a month. I'm not afraid to say it. Yeah, I'm old. I think it's cool that I've survived and managed. I am a walk-in film history. encyclopedia. I love this stuff. Thank you. I love it too. I do intend to do more of it down the line. But yeah, I think anyone who's working in an art form should know the history. I'm also just personally interested in it. Have you ever written an autobiographical screenplay? It should be a fun story with what you're saying here. Yes, thank you. I have. I actually wrote an autobiographical novel first called Temp City, which if I do, I'm planning to self-publish this Writing for Screens book. When I do that, I will then self-publish my novel, most likely. And following that, I'm going to self-publish Temp City, which I wrote in 1989 about being a struggling indie film wannabe in the 1980s in New York. I then wrote a screenplay about it. I will add that into the works. Hey there, Loisel Photography. Andrew, will this live be available on your channel? Yes. Every live I do, the minute it ends, it becomes available on the channel for eternity, or as much of eternity as we can expect now, which is, a year or two. But yes, no, every live I have done is somewhere on my channel. Keep hunting. It's all there. Would a goal of a protagonist be too insane? Something like Taxi Driver. I think the goal of Travis is insane in that moment. It's tricky because the goal is not insane. It's he himself is insane, but his goal is actually to clean up the city and rescue the girl and make a human connection. Those are not insane goals. The things he does when he is motivated to do those things out of frustration for the difficulty of doing them is insane. But the answer to that is, can you do a story about a person with an insane goal? Yes, in these times you can. Do you mean Save the Cat when you talk about 1990 screenplay book? No, that was actually much later. I was actually thinking of Sid Field, who wrote Screenplay, which I really like. I think Sid Field's book Screenplay is really good. But at the same time in the 90s, Robert McKee he didn't do a book for a while, but he would do these weekend lectures, these seminars, which are fictionalized in the movie adaptation. If you haven't seen it, it's phenomenal. And there's a sequence where he goes to this seminar by a guy who's I think he's actually called Robert McKee in the story. Okay, no more comments, please. I apologize. It's ironic that the books that talk about film production, sound design, or directing seem to help me write screenplays more than the useless rules or formula. It is ironic, but it's also true. Once again, I have said that I believe among the best books for screenwriters are Directing Actors by Judith Weston. It's a book about directing actors. By the way, the Sid Field Screenplay was the screenplay book I talked about. And let's see if I can find Directing Actors. Oh, I don't have that. Oh, yeah, I do. Directing Actors by Judith Weston. Really great book, which I think is great about screenwriting, even though it's not about screenwriting. Hey, Link. Better late than not at all. I agree, and I'm so glad you're here. Talking about award ceremonies, Sanchez Pablo says, why the hell the one who wins almost always is a tragedy? Yes, comedy is not taken seriously. Obviously, it's funny, and people think that's not serious. Obviously, comedy can be serious, but it is very, very hard for a comedy of any sort to be taken seriously critically or culturally. Do home videos still exist? It sounds like a century ago. DVDs are still made. VHS is out of business. There are no longer VHS players being made. You will find some people with some old machines, but home video now exists as streaming, as video on demand, as you can rent anything, not anything, but a lot of things on Google, YouTube, Amazon, iTunes. That's home video. You are watching it maybe at home, maybe on your phone, but that you are not going to an exhibition hall to watch a movie. You are bringing it to you. 2 semesters of screenwriting as part of the film curriculum at USC and UCLA. Screenwriting was the fastest way up the ladder. Yes, starting in the 80s and especially in the 90s, screenwriting became a good way in. It was also a depressing way in because, as I've said, your writing got trashed. But yes, you got to work in the business. Now streaming and podcasts change everything. Why the hell is Tarantino making a podcast instead of movies? I don't know. I believe for one thing, I think he likes being a writer as well as other things. He likes being a personality. For whatever reason, he set himself his 10 film goal. He's making his last one. We'll see what happens. The British film industry is way smaller than Hollywood and is very territorial. Do you think I should focus on Hollywood? Actually, no. I would suggest focusing on the big fish in a small pond is a better gig. You have less competition, and you have more direct access to the culture that you're in. So I personally would say no. First of all, I would say DIY if you can. Try and get stuff out there. Try and practice your art. But the other thing is, no, work in the business you're in. You can always use that to then try and open doors in Hollywood, but I would not skip where you are. I personally would advise Hollywood is way, way overcrowded, way, way competitive. Honestly, also because it is not in any way government funded or supported by any artistically minded folks. I don't know what kind of stuff you do, but the British film industry has a much wider artistic range than Hollywood. What do you mean by blockbuster mentality? Blockbuster mentality means the desire to have the largest possible audience and income from ticket sales or downloads or whatever it is. Blockbuster means you are trying to get the number one and ideally beat the number one and become number one in terms of sales. That is not in terms of the scale of the story, although usually a larger scale production will be a more likely blockbuster. But it can happen that things can become big hits when they are small scale. We'll see how Anora does. I don't know. I don't believe Nomadland ever made a lot of money, even though it was great and it won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Anyway, blockbuster mentality became the mentality starting in the 1980s with the corporations taking over the studios, in which sales were the only measure of quality. And that's something that is new and it has changed. That it took a while to build, but the money was big, and the money as a marker of quality, that's what's weird. There's no question that money is the marker of money. It's not necessarily the marker of popularity because many things are being excluded. But even taking money and popularity as twined, you would still say that that's not necessarily a mark of quality. And the question then becomes, what's the point of art? The business, the industry has simply made it common knowledge that popularity is the determination of quality. And that's a weird thought. That's not something that we should take for granted, honestly. There's a lot of other things that go into what makes a piece of art worth engaging with. Popularity is just not the only thing. But that's what the blockbuster mentality is. I saw something in another channel to improve writing dialogues, hand copy Aaron Sorkin scripts. Do you think that would work? I don't know. You have to hand copy it. You could type it. That's what I would do. My handwriting is bad. But yes, no, I do think it's not I don't know that it's a great idea to do too much of it, but it's a cool exercise, which I do recommend, to take a scene you like or a bunch of dialogue you like, watch it, pause it, write it down, put it in script format as you write it, try and get a sense. What I believe that does is it shows you that a movie and a script are very, very different, that the script is not a movie, that a script is just a piece of that project. And to be able to separate the production, the cinematography, the acting, to throw all that out and strip it back down to the words on a page is a valuable experience. I wouldn't do a lot of it. Do you consider yourself an influencer? Maybe, in a minor, like I only influence a very, very small group of people because I just do screenwriting stuff right now. There's just not that many screenwriters. So I guess I would say I'm an uninfluential influencer. The narcs gatekeeping natural talents. Yeah. I mean, yes and no. That's always been true. I hope you keep on working in the industry on your own terms. I don't. I am now working outside the industry on my own terms because this technology is allowing me to. And how cool is that? Luckily, I worked enough in the industry that I can afford to do this and not make any money from it. Looks like the industry prefers short term over long term nowadays. That's generally true. There is not a general long term plan. They go out a couple years for certain because that's how long it takes to do projects and stuff. But yes, no, the business is. We get into a larger critique of capitalism here, but the answer is yes. The goals are profit. The goals are market share. The goals are popularity because of that. And the goal is do whatever it takes and constantly change the plan to do that, whether or not it's artistically or socially or politically or meaningful in any other way. Do what sells. A/B testing is the definition. I don't know if you know what A/B testing is. A/B testing is something that developed with the digital technology. I mean, it always existed in a concept, but you put out two versions of a thing and you see which one is more successful in terms of getting clicks or dollars or whatever it is. You do more of that one. And then you test again and you keep on testing, so that what you're doing is you are guided by response, not by anything else. That's bad. It's bad. I mean, it's good business, but it's bad art. The whole point about art is that you are making choices based on a set of values or feelings. You are saying, I believe this is good. This is worthwhile. This is worth your putting your 2 hours into or your 2 minutes into, whatever it is. You are saying, I like these colors and this music, and I like this kind of story. I believe that's a good thing for you for whatever reason. Maybe that's good because it makes you all hyped up and excited, or maybe it makes you calm. Whatever it is, you believe in that and you put it out there, usually because you like it too. None of that makes any sense if you're doing response testing, because then what you're saying is, what do you want? What do you like? Hey, over here. and whatever gets a reaction, you steer towards that. That is the antithesis of art. So there you go. Why not self-finance your own movie? I did. Now I'm self-financing this, and I will be self-financing my novel. I'm big on that. I don't want to do movies because I'm old and it's physically demanding. It's very, very hard to do. The cool thing about doing my novels, I can do it by myself. I can do it, I wake up very early in the morning. I do my writing early in the morning. I'm not going to get a bunch of people to help me make a movie at 5 a.m. every day. Anyway, thank you, A-Link. I appreciate the like buttons. All right, let's get out of here. Okay. The idea of God versus Buddha, fight until a point till they realize everyone needs to respect each other. It might sound bizarre. No, it sounds cool, but it does sound like something that's, you're going to upset a lot of people who feel that is religious and sacred and therefore not to be trifled with. I don't think it's a bad idea creatively. I do think it's very unlikely for you to be able to sell it to anyone who's in a commercial entertainment business, because they'll be afraid of getting bad responses. And with that, I say so long. I wish you well. I appreciate you listening to me. I hope this was useful, and I hope that you will go write something.